great to be here, exciting, scary, progressive web apps. So this is, my name is Ismael Velasco. I am a software developer in Newport for a company called Kinderly, which is an early years application, nurseries, childminders, etc. And one of the things we were exploring was the PWA route. And obviously that involved doing a bit of research. And what I'm sharing with you is some of the considerations that I think anyone who's considering it doing progressive web apps beyond the tutorial level, at a sort of for a full app in some way, might find helpful. So the sort of first question is, why PWA? Or who gets up one morning and says, let's just change the web? Google does, right? Now, Google already have it pretty covered, right? They've got Chrome and the whole of the internet, and they've got Android, so the whole of mobile. So why would they do this? So on the one hand, they found that both were really good, but they were uneven. So native gave them huge engagement and minimal reach. So 87% of our time on mobile is spent on native apps. Mostly we're just using our apps on our phone. But 80% of our time is just spent on Facebook, Messenger, or YouTube. Now, we're a little bit more tech savvy here, so you might have boycotted Facebook, Messenger, or YouTube. But you probably still spend most of your time on your favorite apps. And that's it. You hardly roam around it. 51% of users in the USA download 0 new apps each month. Must be similar here. So the idea is that basically most of our time is spent on mobile, but actually, that's great news if you're a mobile app developer. The bad news is nobody will find out about your app and nobody will use it. But it's great that it's used on mobile. On the other hand, mobile web delivers minimal engagement but huge reach. So we spend only 13% of our time on the mobile web. If we're on our mobile phone, we're just going to drop into Chrome or sort of Safari or whatever. I know you use Opera. But even though we spend such a minuscule amount of our time on the mobile web, actually the mobile web properties get hugely more visitors and grow faster than native apps. And we discover 100 new sites each month. So you're actually going all over the place when you're going on the mobile web. And most mobile native properties are driven, the growth of your mobile app is mostly driven by your web property. So someone goes to your website and discovers you have an app and goes, ooh, I want it. But the point of discovery seems to be mostly the web. So Google, being Google, thought, this is native reach versus web reach. So you do a lot of actions on your app versus on the mobile web, but you'll have a lot more unique users on the web versus your mobile app. So mommy web and daddy native got together and gave birth to little baby PWA. And that's why they did it, right? That's why Google did it. They were everywhere, but they wanted everyone at all times. Big brother now has a little sibling. But then the question becomes, why PWA for anyone who doesn't just want to be up with the latest sort of Google release? And there's a few Google releases that haven't really taken off. Or who gets up one morning and says, if it ain't broke, fix it anyway? Facebook is doing pretty well on mobile and on web. Tinder is doing pretty well, but they both gone the PWA route. So if it ain't broke, why fix it? So these are the reasons why the bigger early adopters have gone for it. So data investment costs are cut by 90% for Tinder, and load times cut from 12 seconds to 4.5 seconds. Because you're drawing everything from the cache, then you're actually consuming a lot less data. If your app is global and connectivity is not taken for granted, then this is an extra as well as the speed, actually it's much cheaper, so more people will join your app. Flipkart found 3 times longer on site at 3 times less data cost, 40% higher re-engagement rate, 70% greater conversion rate. Alibaba, 76% rise in conversions, 4 times interaction rate. Lancome, 53% increase in session length. Bounce rates dropped 10% amongst even iPhone users. So I made this one in particular because iPhone support said less than Android, but even on iPhone, the PWA delivered some gains for some of the big early adopters. Time to interactive reduced by 75% from Pinterest, from 23 to 5.6 seconds. And Make My Trip, again, other fantastic sort of things. So all these names at the bottom are companies that have gone the PWA route. So it is based on actual sort of commercial value at the end that has driven people who had already pretty successful properties to do this, which gives us a summary. So why PWAs? The meetup of these two things. On the one hand, sort of is to achieve native-like experiences on the mobile web and improve discovery of your app, engagement with your app, retention, speed, economy, and simplicity, maintainability. So if you have if your mobile strategy is PWA, then you're only maintaining a single code base as opposed to a code base for your mobile app and a code base for your web app. So what is a progressive web app? Most people just focus on the requirements, but I think actually thinking about a progressive web app as a commercial product involves more than that. So yes, I would define a progressive web app as a set of requirements. So this is what you need. If you have these things, you've got a progressive web app. That's what tends to be discussed. And capabilities. So progressive web app allows you to achieve a range of things. But it is also, and this is less often discussed, a set of design principles and a set of architectures to deliver on those design principles, a set of strategies that you have to implement and choose from in order to deliver on that, a set of tools that you might want to use to achieve your PWA, and finally a set of workarounds to get past the limitations that PWA may have. So if you are only down to the requirements and capabilities, which is what you'll mostly see online, it doesn't really give you a realistic perspective of what it will involve for your business or for yourself to actually go the full PWA way. So the requirements are actually incredibly simple. Your website needs to be delivered over HTTPS, and if not, shame on you. But also, it's not going to work very long, right? So that's already on the way. You have to have a web manifest and service workers. The web manifest, for anyone who doesn't know about it, is just basically a JSON document that gives you a set of properties that allow the browser to recognize your website as a progressive web app. It uses the manifest to go, ooh, treat this website differently. Harness, sort of trigger the web API PWA capabilities, as it were. And service workers, again, just I am assuming most people know about it, but service workers are basically something that intercepts your calls for your HTTP calls, and instead of going direct to the server, it routes them. And then you decide, look for this page in the server or look for this page in the cache, in your own thing. And this is how the data gains are achieved, because sort of instead of having to download every time every single page, and therefore losing connectivity, unlike a mobile app, when the web goes, then you go into your web app and you get a blank screen. Actually, you have you try through service workers to preserve as much of the functionality offline as you have online. So you deliver an app-like experience and you save on data costs. But basically, as long as you have these three things, automatically your website becomes a progressive web app. And so these three requirements automatically make accessible to you a set of capabilities. So one is generic capabilities. So whatever browser you're using, these capabilities will magically appear the moment you have those three requirements. You have your HTTPS, your Web Manifest and Service Workers, you will be able to deliver offline caching, tap into geolocation, tap into the magnetometer, accelerometer, gyroscope, the camera, the audio output, some speech synthesis, the payment request API, and some of the funkier new stuff like WebAssembly and WebRTC and WebGL, which of course everybody's using all the time. But, and I'm putting iOS Plus because although actually it was iOS who first thought really of the concept of progressive apps, they just left it. Google brought it, everybody thought it was superb. iOS kind of has been humming and ahhing, and it's just very recently that they've properly joined up and supported service workers. So that means that with some exceptions, there are a few things you can do on iOS that you cannot do in Chrome and PWA, but very few. This is basically what you get as standard. And then the rest is progressive. That means that, so we'll get back to the concept of progressive in a second. But the progressive capabilities, the ones that you will only get if you are accessing Chrome, for example, is, and these are big ones, the web app banner to invite the user to install the app. So if you have a web manifest and you've sort of instructed it in that way and sort of linked the assets, then if you're on iOS, nothing will happen. You'll go into your website and you'll have just that website and you have to get around it. But if you're on Chrome, you'll get a lovely thing that says, do you want to install this app? And then if you press on that app, it's going to feel like an app. It's going to create the icon, it's going to load, and then you've got it on the app. All that happens in Chrome, it doesn't happen in iOS. Web push notifications, you can get through Chrome, you can't get through iOS. Background sync, you can customize the splash screen and orientations a little bit. Access to Bluetooth, web share, speech recognition, as opposed to speech synthesis. So Chrome will give you more than iOS. But all of these things are already accessible the instant you put those three requirements. The other thing to say about this is that the field is moving at tremendous speed. So this is current I think as of a month and a half ago. It is quite possible that by now there's a few more things that PWA supports. So it's worth checking. But the key thing is that all of this is useless unless you have a design concept. So all of those things, all of those capabilities are there to make it possible for you to achieve these design aims. The goal is for you to achieve a website that is app-like, that is fast, that is reliable and continues to work and function when it's offline, and that is engaging, that retains you, that gives you notifications, that draws you in, the same as a mobile app would. So to achieve those design goals, you'll have to make architectural considerations. Your architectural considerations will determine different implementations of the PWA, different strategies. One of them is pretty critical, is mobile first. That is the entry level. If you have a fantastic website that accesses push notifications, etc., but spills over your screen on a mobile, that's going to be a rubbish PWA. So you begin by ensuring that your website is totally responsive. If it is totally responsive, then PWA will allow you to add on top of it progressive enhancements to iOS, to Chrome, etc. But that means that if you're considering migrating to PWA, your very first consideration is my website mobile first? Does it actually function already as a mobile website? And then these other things will determine how you approach everything from your tooling to your caching strategies to everything. So are you building or converting a small or a huge site? Is it particularly in terms of complexity? Is it like really complex or quite straightforward? Single page versus multi-page? Have you used a framework? PWA will be likely easier, or no framework. Do you use server-side rendering or client-side rendering? Is your website highly dynamic or highly static? If it's highly static, you can create a fantastic PWA in about 10 minutes. If it's highly dynamic, you might take a bit longer. So this is what I mean, that actually approaching a PWA is about having also an architectural sort of vision, as it were, and understanding. So those architectures will then dictate your strategies, particularly around caching. So your service workers can deliver different strategies for different assets. So some assets you might only want to be reached from the network. So you might never want to for your app to look first in the cache. So maybe it is something to do with payments, for example, where actually you don't want that to work offline. You want to ensure that people are connecting to the network. But there are other things where you might want to always look first in the cache, assets that you do not change very much. So if your overall shop front is pretty stable, then probably you don't want the users to keep downloading your logo and everything else. You want them to just look first, and then if it's not in your cache, then look for it in the network. There are some which you might say, for example, if it's a news app, you might want not to have a blank page until the new article sort of downloads onto your app. So maybe you load the last article first until the next article is downloaded, and then it gets refreshed. But that means that your app is always functional in that sense. So you choose from these strategies how it is, and obviously it'll be different if your website is just a static website. You're not going to want to do a lot of this. But if you have a website that is hugely dynamic, then clearly some assets will fit into different strategies. So how do you do this then? You could just go vanilla all the way, but there is now an element of tooling that has emerged. So cheat ones like PWA Builder or PWAify. So those are fantastic if you have a static site. So if you have a static site where it's mostly a shop front, but you want it to be really quick, you want it to be accessible offline, you want some of those advantages, then you just put your domain on PWA Builder, it modifies your assets, and in 10 minutes you have a working PWA, literally 10 minutes, that's enough. If you're looking for something a bit more complicated, a bit more dynamic, a bit more, then sort of you might want to turn to libraries. The standard is Workbooks. Workbooks is what Google has developed and is like the state of play, the state of the art. It takes over SW Precache and SW Toolbox. So that was the state of the art until Workbooks came along and kind of integrated them and sort of refined them. So for instance, the strategies I mentioned here that you can and would not often code just directly vanilla, they're all promises. Here, you can just call them. You can go, I want to apply this strategy through this library, and it works. But there's also sort of a range of others that sort of are, depending on the complexity of what you're building, might or might not be more helpful. And then you have integrations. So StoreHippo is the first e-commerce platform that already sort of delivers PWA sort of from the word go. React app by default creates a PWA, so that just generally works. Testers, particularly Lighthouse, is the essential place. So if anyone hasn't used Lighthouse is, you should. It's a fantastic tool. that was developed by Google and is not just for PWA. It gives you a diagnostic and a score of how responsive your website is and how accessible your website is and how PWA ready your website is. But it doesn't just give you a score, it gives you very precise diagnostics as to what specific things could be improved and how you could improve them. So a lot of the PWA process is often about getting a baseline on Lighthouse and then improving the score in progressive iterations. And then so that there's lots of resources. YouTube, particularly the Google channels, are particularly good. Google Labs is again fantastic for it. The offline cookbook is a really helpful one, etc. And I created a little playlist, more or less in order of some good video resources for anyone who's interested. So as you then go into actually building a PWA, what does that feel like in practice? Well, the idea is, I think, to do this iteratively. A PWA is a design concept rather than a product. So PWA can just start here, sort of, you've improved your performance on Lighthouse, you've ensured that your sort of assets are minified, you've done whatever is needed to have basically a mobile-first app, something that really works well as a website on your mobile. And then you decide to add service workers for offline caching. And suddenly you've cut the speed of loading, the data, etc. And already that, if you have any web app, it's worth doing this because this will already improve your website, even if you don't turn it into a mobile equivalent. Having done that, you might then get to push notifications, you might have add to home screen, you might do credentials and payments, but none of this has to happen all at once. You can just keep doing iterations, and the beautiful thing about this is that it is progressive. So every enhancement adds value. If you just did this, your website is already better than it was, and you haven't changed anything else. This then becomes, and you haven't even used it to create an app equivalent. You've only used it to improve the speed and the reliability and the efficiency of it. I've said then that a PWA is sort of your requirements, your capabilities, your architectural principles, your strategies, and your tools. But it's also workarounds, because a PWA still does not match a native app or is not cross-platform. So it doesn't cache post requests. So that's an issue, because if you want someone to be writing, for example, sort of an essay on your fantastic progressive web app offline, when they click send, by default, it's just going to disappear because PWA does not cache post requests. So in order to make it truly sort of functional offline at all levels, you have to implement a workaround. There's a link here for someone's workaround. There are others, obviously. Apple Store, Play, Google Play, Microsoft Store. Microsoft is actually really easy. Apple and Play, you can do it, but it's a hassle. So if you want your web app to be, your PWA to be in the stores, then you'll need to do some extra work. Now, one of the main rationales for PWA is that nobody will find your app in the store anyway. So the whole point of it is for people to not have to go to the store, search for your app, download it and run it, because they come into your website and they've got the app in 2 steps. But if you do want it for branding reasons or whatever, then that's a workaround. And then iOS alternatives. If you want your app to deliver us the equivalent functionality on iOS, you'll need to create workarounds for the add to home screen. So you may have bumped into it already. There are some sites that give you a little pop-up in iPhone that say, would you like to add this to your home screen? And that's their equivalent of the nice sort of Chrome app-like experience, because you can't just access it in the same way. So it's a bit trickier. Background sync, various things like that, you might need to do some workarounds. Once you have all that, then you have your full PWA concept. So to go from a website to a PWA, I would suggest that you begin with analysis. You analyze what kind of website have you got, what kind of value you want to add. For example, your value might end at offline caching, and really clever offline caching, so that actually your app runs really quickly, is really available, etc. Or you really do want, actually, instead of investing on a separate code base because you want a mobile app and you already have a web app, you actually do want to create PWA as a mobile app replacement. So what will that involve, etc. Then you prioritize your enhancements, your progressive enhancements. Choose the tools that are appropriate, implemented, evaluated, and do that in cycles. So you don't have to take on a massive waterfall project. You can actually just deliver immediate value to whatever web assets you have and just keep adding to it. So why not? Not all that glitters is gold. And actually, just because Tinder likes it and you want a date, it doesn't mean that you have to do it too, right? So actually, if it ain't broke, maybe don't fix it, right? So you already have a perfectly functioning mobile app, and you don't use your website that way. Great. One that I don't have is, if it is broke, maybe don't fix it either. So that's what happened with us, for example. It's a startup. The code base is in quite a complex state of play. Some things are really nice. Some things are a bit trickier. It doesn't all have a fantastic framework order from the beginning to end. So actually, for us, at the end of all that, we thought that to deliver a proper mobile experience, it was probably less effort to go down a mobile app route than to do all the architectural decisions involved in it. But if our code had been more nicely architectured, then this would probably have been a much quicker and better win. So that's one. Another one is, if you actually don't use the web at all, then you might just want to use a native-only app. However, if people are still not discovering your app, or your audience is an issue, I think the research is misleading insofar as the evidence base is just the big mammoths who already have brand recognition. I haven't seen any studies as to whether discovery is dramatically higher if you're starting from zero on a PWA versus the Apple Store. I don't know. But the signs are that it's probably true that simply because there are less steps and people are most likely to bump into you on the web anyway, if you can get them to mobile straight away from your website, then some people have used PWAs as bridges, so that they get onto the website, they get onto the PWA, and then if they want extras, they go onto the actual mobile app. But by then they played with it, etc. So that's another one. And the last reason where you definitely would not snog or marry, but definitely avoid a PWA, is if you want to access native-only functionality. PWA doesn't give you virtual reality. So it would be good to establish that first, right? Light sensors, etc. So, those would be the reasons why you wouldn't do it. So I think that's it. I'm happy to take comments, questions, etc. But hopefully that's an overview of some sort, good or bad. So thank you. Oh, I was about to say also really happy not to take any questions. Sorry.
You made it sound good. What's the worst thing about PWA applications?
Well, the thing is, because PWA is a design concept rather than a product, then it really depends on your implementation. I could imagine, as I say, a really terrible PWA where you've got all the funky functionality but really bad CSS. That would be a really bad PWA. Another one would be one where you're fighting, in a sense, against your tools. If you make the wrong strategic choices, for example, and you are getting from cache stuff that needs to be really current. So if you're going for your latest news to your cache first, that's probably not going to be a good one. But I don't think there's anything intrinsically worse or good. In fact, I think generally speaking, I cannot see many scenarios where if you have a website, adding some element of PWA functionality would not add value. I think in most cases it would. But I think that I don't think there's anything bad about PWAs, but I could imagine bad implementations of it.
In Android, I believe that you have to visit a site a couple of times within a certain time frame before it pops up and says, would you like to add this to your home screen? Is that the case with the Apple workaround?
You can tailor that. You can actually specify in the manifest for Chrome how many times people have to visit before it pops up, whether it's instantly or afterwards, how long it retains it. There are variants like that, so your stuff, I think, will be retained a lot longer in Chrome than in iOS in the cache, but in iOS it's still retained for a long time. So, yeah.
One of the slides you mentioned that they had a 30% saving on data investment. Is that data transmission or?
Yes, so from the point of view of the user. So because you're no longer making the calls for most of your assets and you now have a fully functional app offline, then actually, because of those strategies, cache first, network first, etc., if you've got the right mix, then now you're only using, in that case, presumably, I mean, it's not a numerical one, but let's say for simplicity, they're now using 30% of the calls they used to do before that. So your data consumption is less. But it's not the data investment for the company, it's the data investment for the user.
So there's an obvious imbalance between Apple and Chrome in terms of what they're capable of doing in a PWA. So do you think that's going to change soon? And does that mean that developing an Apple app is inherently more valuable than developing the Chrome app because you can probably cover the Chrome version in PWA? I
think it depends what functionalities you want to do. So if you have functionalities that iOS does not deliver that are essential for your product, then possibly iOS would be better. The big question at the moment in the space is, will PWAs take over mobile altogether or not? I think most the people I sort of tend to agree with is that they're likely to both coexist for quite a while. I think they each give you something else. What is, I think, pretty likely is that there's a lot of growing momentum in PWA, which means that iOS will invest more simply to catch up. I think it was more in question a few months ago, but now that iOS have actually put their hat into the ring, so to speak, and supported it, and added some functionalities that Chrome doesn't add, then I suspect that it will grow. And remember that the key selling point of PWAs is reach. So the logic that made this gain traction is that you might have a fantastic Apple app, but it doesn't matter if no one uses it. And people use YouTube, Facebook, and I forgot the other one off the top of my head, but they use 5 apps basically. So the evidence so far suggests that if you go down the PWA route, whoever you are, you're going to get more users because you're cutting the whole user journey dramatically. But again, if what your actual app requires are things that sort of Chrome doesn't deliver, then sort of iOS would be better. But I think it is a very personal thing. But overall, I think at the moment we haven't gotten to the point where PWA is an equal competitor to native overall in functionality, but it is a competitor in use. And from the looks of the traction it's gaining, I think it's reasonable to guess that over the next year, the gap will narrow significantly.
Thank you very much.